Hi there, this is a lecture I gave to the Open Learning Initiative of the Central European University. There were lots of participants and great questions, but it wasn't recorded, so I apologize that the questions are not here, but I wanted to leave a record of what I did, and I'll try to keep it to about 20 minutes. Authoritarian neoliberalism, radical conservatism, and social policy in Europe. We'll look a bit more at the geographical spread of this in a minute, but just the two photographs on the opening slide. The one on the bottom left is a march in Croatia against the Istanbul Convention of the Council of Europe, a convention on domestic violence that actually, until the radical right started a campaign against aspects of it, nobody really paid very much attention to. The very innocent-looking photograph on the right is of a city, Szombathely in Hungary, shortly after the Hungarian government passed a law making homelessness illegal. It's a park, and you can see the loudspeakers that actually are used to tell the homeless that are using the park to disperse, and if they don't, then police and or community workers come on the scene. And Szombathely is the hometown. Szombathely is the hometown of Noemi Lenvai-Bainton, a Hungarian scholar living and working in the UK. And we wrote together this article that was published in Development and Change, where we looked at Croatia, Hungary, and Poland. And we looked at those countries because we know about them. But we could have looked at other countries within Europe. And certainly some of the things we're talking about can also be found elsewhere in the United States, in Brazil, perhaps even in India. And so I don't really want to be particularly geographically specific in this talk. I also think it's really important when talking about an academic text about why it was written. And of course, the crude reason is that we were asked to do it by somebody from the journal Development and Change, because they had a lot of articles on what they called the dark side of social policy, looking particularly in the developing world and the global south, and they wanted a text on Europe. So we did that. But I think it's part of work, ongoing work, myself and others, which is very much against two tendencies, two kind of disciplines, if you like. One is social policy, and the way it's become a very, very technical discipline. It focuses on fixed sectors. You have social policy books that are about employment and the labour market, social protection, social inclusion, healthcare, so on and so forth. So it focuses on very fixed sectors, and a real tendency in literature and in conferences to focus on number crunching. You find two variables, you try to look at the correlation between them. And a lot of this technical work on social policy really ignores political economy. On the other side, political economy, whether in its liberal version or its more radical or critical version, tends to ignore social policy. The very phrase political economy, it's about politics and economics. Social policy, if it is treated at all, is treated as a kind of residual consequence of political economy. And this text and the work that I've done with Noemi Lenvai over many, many years argues very differently, that social policy is actually a key arena of struggle for a hegemonic moral economy. All economies are moral economies. They speak discursively to what ought to be, and some are dominant and others are counter-hegemonic or in opposition. And social policy is a shifting domain. What counts in social policy it varies in different conjunctures, and radical restructurings of social provisioning and social ordering can take place. And I think this is really, really important. There are two other things which are relevant here. One is the treatment of gender in the text. Too often, of course, in both social policy and political economy, gender is ignored completely. Or conversely, it is the only thing that is addressed. And this text really tries to put gender as part of a kind of critical political economy of social policy. The last point by way of introduction is that I'm not a great fan of comparative social policy. And yet this is a comparative social policy text. We compare and contrast Poland, Hungary, and Croatia. I'm not a fan of it because it's the same global capitalism. It just takes different forms in different nation states, and sovereign nation states do still have power to make political, social policy choices. Another issue is, of course, we're grappling in the text with what is meant by neoliberalism, a much overused word, and what we need to, I think, look at is different macro-institutional frameworks, as Neil Brenner has argued. There are continuities and discontinuities played out over time, so that actually what we're looking at here cannot be understandable without reference to neoliberalism and neoliberal restructurings, but it cannot be understood only through those neoliberal structurings. Okay. Before the next slide, a trigger warning. This is Viktor Orban, and I won't read the quote. It's one of the famous quotes from Orban from 2014. But I think there are three elements to this quote which show discursively what's really going on in authoritarian neoliberalism. The first is, of course, this rejection of welfare states and an explicit political commitment to a workfare state. So workfare becomes not just a technical means of organizing public works so that those who are unemployed have to do something in return for benefits, but it becomes a key philosophical and political category. The second is, of course, his embracing of the supposed critique of Hungary as an illiberal state. So we don't really deny the foundational values of liberalism, but we don't see being liberal as a central element of the state. So illiberalism is celebrated. And the third point, of course, is it's all about the nation. The state and the nation as an illiberal form come together through the way in which we've gone beyond welfare. And that, I think, that discursive assemblage is really, really important to understand the discourse of Orban and the new authoritarian neoliberal radical right. It's not really good to quote from your own article, but I do think this quite short quote kind of grasps the things that we want to put together in terms of what authoritarian neoliberalisms are. And we take that phrase, that concept, as a shorthand term for a governmental project. So Foucault is very relevant here. A governmental project that uses social, political, and economic means. So the social is right up there with the political and the economic, to produce targeted and systematic divisions, insecurity, and abandonment, resting inter alia on a renewed heteronormative familialism. The idea that the good family, the normal family, is heterosexual. Repatriarchalization, the reassertion of patriarchal structures. National and ethnicized demographic renewal. And crucially, anti-immigrant sentiments. So those are distinct but come together in this authoritarian neoliberal formation that we're discussing. Here's Margaret Thatcher, not one of the more famous quotes about there is no such thing as society, but the state should be a servant, not a master. And access to social citizenship in terms of authoritarian neoliberalism is absolutely crucial, because it's social citizenship for some, but not for others. And who the some are will vary, but in the countries we look at, it's certainly good citizens who are defined ethno-nationally. So they're good Hungarians, good Poles, good Croats, the deserving poor, the poor who are poor, but they are trying very hard to get out of poverty, they acknowledge their responsibilities. Normal families links to the heteronormative familialism that I just referred to on the previous slide. In Croatia, particularly, war veterans and defenders, there are 500,000 registered war veterans. Together with their families, they get heightened benefits. The diaspora, Hungary, Poland, and Croatia, have extended rights to the diaspora that include social citizenship and social rights. And this works together with a kind of clientelistic and partitocratic system in which, as we saw in Croatia during the COVID-19 crisis, heads of old people's homes are chosen because they are members of the ruling party, not because of any qualifications, skills and experiences that they might have had. And of course, the post-colonial theory, the othering. Social citizenship is in some ways formally or informally denied to others, minorities, particularly Roma in our region, migrants and asylum seekers, single mothers, LGBT identified people and households, those lacking the work ethic who are in contrast with the deserving poor, and so on and so forth. But crucially, and if you read our article, Poland is a good example of this. It's not just about cutting welfare expenditure for everybody. Poland has increased welfare spending, albeit from a low base for certain groups. But it's what we call layered or variegated welfare. So you have benefits for some, but you have a complex of disciplinary, policing and exclusionary practices for others. As in Orban's quote, punitive workfare replaces what Thatcher called the nanny state. We can't have the state taking care of us from the cradle to the grave. Again, this access to social citizenship is gendered, but it's gendered in complicated ways. It's not that women are excluded from social citizenship. Work-life balance for some is quite important. Hungary has seen an increase in women in the formal labour market. There are rewards for mothers of the nation, those mothers who have children, so it's linked very much to demographic renewal. But any kind of gendered transgression, stepping out of what are seen as appropriate gendered roles, is punished. And centrally to this, at least latterly since the first wave of migration from Syria and Libya and so on, is an anti-migrant discourse. And you see that on the bottom right, Orban's famous Stop Immigration election poster, which folds age, gender and race together. These are migrants, these are male, unattached migrants of a certain age, and therefore the threat is increased by that folding together of age, gender and race. Radical conservatism, and I think this is really the element that one can find very much in Poland, Hungary and Croatia. And let us not underestimate, it's important to take seriously the radical right. This is a coherent and powerful transnational movement led by the evangelical Christian right. One can see some of its roots in the United States, but there are also roots in Europe. And really, it is a movement with three key political goals. One is to be against gay marriage, and one sees campaigns. In Croatia, a referendum that was won, which means that the constitution defines marriage as a union of a man and a woman. You can see the slogan of "In the name of the family." Marriage is a man and a woman, anything else is something else. And the word drugo also means is secondary, so it's of lesser importance. So it's against gay marriage, and it's against access to adoption and fostering for gays and lesbians. Crucially, it's about limiting access to abortion, so there are blockades of abortion, of hospitals where abortions are carried out. There are conscience clauses for medical staff, so that in Croatia, for example, there are many parts of the country where you don't have access to abortion. and there are laws, particularly in Poland, to restrict access to abortion. So those are two elements. And the third is relatively recent, and it relates to the use of the Istanbul Convention as a symbol, because what this is against is so-called gender ideology. And gender ideology says that male and female are not fixed roles, but that they are fluid and socially constructed, and therefore transsexuality is possible. So it's against that. Sorry, I'll shut the window. Still a lot of noise, but hopefully you can't hear it. Demographic renewal, of course. Child benefits have been increased, particularly in Poland. Stay-at-home mother schemes have been introduced in Zagreb, so you don't provide mothers with health and unemployment insurance, but you give them money which is not significantly less than minimum wage to stay home and have children for the nation. And there were lots of questions about this when I gave the lecture a few days ago. This has a contradictory relationship. The radical conservative, radical religious right has a contradictory relationship to Islamophobia. Clearly, there's a Christian dimension to this, a Catholic dimension to this, which is anti-Islam, Islam as the other, but it can also share with some tendencies, conservative tendencies in Islam, a anti-gay position. So it's complicated and contradictory. Let's end with Lenin. What is to be done? How can we kind of work? How can we be part of movements and discourses? And discourses are really important here, against this kind of authoritarian neoliberalism and radical conservatism. I do think the current crisis that we're in, the COVID-19 context, is important. What we've seen in many authoritarian states is an increase in authoritarianism. Sometimes disguised as expert-driven knowledge, but actually often through curfews and rather eccentric authoritarian measures. It's really not about keeping the virus under control. We've seen, I think, the invisibilization, if that's an English, a word in English, of migrants and asylum seekers. This huge threat is now kind of ignored, but so is the possibility, the importance of social and health protection for migrants and asylum seekers. Other marginalized groups, prisoners, people in care homes, have faced a similar kind of invisibilization. We've seen rescue packages, but those are to business. They're supposed to trickle down to some workers in the formal economy, but they don't necessarily do that. Croatia has introduced packages which are very non-transparent, and actually there will be very few networks of accountability to make sure that firms actually do pass them on to their workforce. Let's not expect the EU to come riding to the rescue on a white horse. The EU is very much, the gap between rhetoric and reality within the EU is even more important now. I think the recent German court ruling has shown how fiscal consolidation and austerity are kind of built into the new DNA of the EU. And a social EU, even a liberal EU, are little more than convenient fictions. And the EU doesn't really do anything to promote social policy and doesn't really do anything to maintain liberal social democracy. There is an alternative. Thatcher, of course, famously, there is no alternative. Tina, I've been writing about the importance of a combination during the crisis, but also as an exit strategy from the crisis, of universal basic income, combined with progressive taxation, of course, universal quality public services, so not stigmatizing, reducing inequalities in access, but also grassroots solidarity, what some people have called the care commons, or a wonderful movement, Pirate Care, mutual aid. So I'm not talking about NGOs and charities that can be just as disciplinary as public services. We should demand eco-social policies, circular economies, local production and consumption. but we should beware of the danger of eco-social policies actually taking us into the arms of the ecological right. Jobbik, the extreme right party in Hungary, has eco-social policies as one of its policy platforms. And finally, and perhaps naively, ambitiously, or in terms of utopia, we need kind of new social movements in which radicalized students, I'm very impressed by the work that people have been doing, students have been doing at Central European University, workers, including precarious workers, professionals. I think we're going to see a movement of a radicalization of healthcare workers, of social workers, rainbow coalitions around age, gender, different migrant groups and so on. Maybe this is a new kind of political actor or set of political actors that can actually advocate for some change. That's it. Do read the article. Here's my email. Let's carry on the dialogue. Yes, I have recently been writing about universal basic income, and you can find this on Left East website. Thanks very much.